Welcome to Your Path to Nonprofit Leadership, the weekly podcast that features the very best in career development in the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Patton McDowell, and in addition to podcasting, I'm a leadership coach, a mastermind facilitator, a best-selling author, and a speaker. I love taking these nonprofit leadership topics on the road or into your Zoom room. So if you need someone at your next conference or workshop, check out my new speaking page at pattonmcdowell.com for more information. Well, I know you're going to enjoy another fantastic conversation in this episode with Andrew Olsen, who returns to the path after his enormously successful visit last time. It was episode number 145, in which we tackled toxic leadership in the nonprofit sector. Well, Andrew has more wisdom to share, and this time we're going to dive into a staple of most nonprofit organizations and their revenue plan, which is direct response fundraising. Well, the first thing Andrew is going to explain, of course, is what is direct response fundraising and how many of the high volume efforts you might be employing in your annual fund or direct mail campaigns, how they may in fact not be effective. Now, he explains the inner workings of this process and what questions you need to be asking, especially if you're outsourcing these direct response activities to an outside firm. Once again, Andrew has brought great value and many takeaways, so don't forget to check out the show notes for this episode. It's number 198. Just go to the new podcast page at pattonmcdowell.com, and you will find all of the resources mentioned, including more information on Andrew and how you can access some of the great content he's producing through his books, his blog, his podcast, which is called the Rainmaker Fundraising Podcast, as well as more information on his new role as Senior Vice President at Dickerson Baker. Without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Andrew Olsen. Andrew, thank you for joining me again on the path.
Hey, Patton, thanks again for having me. I always appreciate a chance to talk with you and to engage with your listeners as well. It's good to see you.
Well, clearly, indeed, it is good to see you, and our listeners clearly like what you're saying. In fact, the last time you visited Your Path to Nonprofit Leadership, in fact, it was episode number 145. It's one of the most popular episodes we've ever had. So I'm going to encourage our listeners to check it out. And that's where you and I tackled toxic leadership, which is certainly a topic that you have articulated very well, some of the challenges and opportunities for improvement. So naturally, I want you back to talk about another topic that is top of mind for you. And of course, the headline for this episode has gotten their attention already, Andrew. Listeners are reading Dirty Little Secrets of Direct Response Fundraising. So you got my attention. I'm sure you've got our listeners' attention. So let's start with that. For our nonprofit leaders that maybe aren't as immersed in some of the fundraising tactical activities, what is direct response fundraising?
Sure thing. Yeah. So direct response fundraising is really, it's kind of what it sounds like, right? So it is fundraising tactics that are designed to elicit an immediate response. And the most common of these is going to be direct mail, right? I send out a mailing to a list of supporters, and my expectation and what I'm asking them to do is to respond directly back to me via the envelope in that mailing. This extends to, in the online world, though, email campaigns, search and display marketing online, social media marketing. If you're asking for donations in social media, that's technically direct response fundraising. And then at the very high investment levels and sort of scaled levels, you even have things like direct response television. So if you've seen a Wounded Warrior Project television commercial, or a Shriners Hospitals for Children or St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, those commercials are direct response television commercials that are designed to elicit a gift transaction as the end result of that effort.
Yeah, thank you. And again, we're going to unpack that and really dive into your expertise on some of the do's and don'ts maybe of this process. And I guess let me start with this as an opening question. As a nonprofit leader, and certainly staff and board as well might be thinking, Andrew, this is efficient. Why shouldn't I go for kind of a volume tactic and get my message out to everybody? And surely I'll raise a lot of money, but what are the dangers of approaching things with what I would call a volume fundraising mentality?
Yeah, you know, I will say that there was a time when the like mass volume strategy made sense, right? So, you know, I've been doing this work and particularly direct response work for almost 25 years now. And when I first started in this industry, the volume players made a lot of sense. They generated a ton of response, they generated a ton of revenue, and to your point, like it was efficient, right? You didn't have to add headcount, you didn't have to add, you know, a bunch of staff time and effort to manage things. You could literally tell an outside vendor, "Go do this for me," and you go focus on other things. But the marketplace has changed significantly. If we look at the drop off in giving from individual donors over the last 20 years, it's pretty staggering. And you know, I'm also looking at current data. So Pew Charitable Trust released some data at the middle of December last year, and one of the findings that they had when they looked at income distribution across those who are of high wealth, moderate, you know, mid-level wealth, and low income, the most staggering thing that I saw is that people in the middle income category have lost almost 50% of their aggregate household income over the last 40 years.
Wow.
And those are exactly the people who give primarily through direct response, right? They're the people who write a $30, $50, $70, $100 check to a mailing. So, you know, as I think about this, when I think about, you know, does it make sense to be high volume, highly efficient tactical program? There's a place for some of that, certainly in bringing new donors into your organization.
Yeah.
But the organizations that are not, that are focusing on relationships and bringing in maybe fewer donors, but donors who are more connected to mission, who are more inclined to give longer term and to give bigger gifts over time, whether that's like writing one big check or a bunch of smaller checks. Those organizations are the ones that are going to be able to withstand what's going on economically and just from an overall kind of demographic shift in the world. And you know, we were talking, you and I, off camera a few minutes ago, but one of the things that I think gets lost here in this idea of like, let's just be big and efficient and go for volume. I was talking to a charity a few weeks ago, and they doubled the size of their donor base during the pandemic. They went from like 15,000 to 30,000 donors.
Yeah.
And on its face, that looks really good, right? You look at that and you go, wow, that's amazing growth. But when we got under the hood and we started to look at retention data, their retention rate was under 5%. So
Wow.
when you think about that, all the money and the time and the effort that they spent to bring those new supporters into their organization, to only hold on to 5% of them at the top over a 3-year period. I mean, it's staggeringly bad. And so that's sort of my counterpoint and my perspective on you know, why it doesn't make sense at this point in our world to be an organization that is primarily securing your funding through high volume direct response.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I guess I would underline that you're not against donor acquisition tactics, of course. You know, we all need to have something to bring new folks into our ecosystems of philanthropy. But you're right. I think we can stop at that high level metric, as you just said, for that organization, right? We doubled the number of donors in our system. So clearly we must be doing things better. And you're in fact saying, no, you may not be. And well, and I guess the origin of your article and other content, Andrew, around this dirty little secret is, unfortunately, some of the companies that help nonprofits, maybe they're at counter purpose, right, with nonprofits because they want volume too.
Absolutely. You know, it's interesting. I wrote an article, excuse me, on LinkedIn a week or so ago about this very thing. And what prompted it was the CEO of a direct response fundraising agency had posted something saying individual giving rates are down yet again this year, you know, multi-year decline in giving rates. And therefore, we as a sector must lean more aggressively into new donor acquisition. And my response to that was, that's just the stupidest thing I've ever heard.
Right.
And the reason is, you know, I likened it to an automobile, right? If you have a fuel leak and every time you put gas in in the car, you're just leaking that fuel out the fuel pump, and your tank's not holding that fuel. The solution is not go put more gas in the car. It's fix the hole.
Exactly.
And then once the hole's fixed, by all means, fill the tank up, right? But we're doing ourselves a disservice. We're doing the mission a disservice, and we're doing donors a disservice by saying the solution to every problem is just more acquisition. It's just patently stupid. And unfortunately, it's the result. That recommendation is the result of having a toolkit that's only full of hammers, and therefore thinking that every problem is a nail.
Yeah, great examples, great analogies in several cases, and you're right. We stop too short, and we just throw more gas in the tank, not addressing the fundamental. We're dealing with the symptoms, right? Instead of where the actual cause of this illness. And it seems to me, Andrew, this just leads fundamentally to more and more transactional relationships, right? High volume, low touch. Is never going to develop the relationships. And I guess that's another thesis, I think, for you, right? Fundamentally, is relationship building is where we need to be focused.
It is. I and our team, we're really fond of the statement that, relationships change everything. And we see that on the service side of the world. I've worked a lot with homeless shelters and rescue missions in my career. And one of the things that they find is that most of the people that come through their doors that need help, it's not just that they ran out of money, right? It's not just that they ran out of housing options. It's that they ran out of relationship, and when they lacked those relationships and that connectivity, that's what made them susceptible to other things like drug and alcohol addiction, made it easier to lose their job or lose their home and not have a safety net to fall back on because they didn't have those relationships. The same thing's true with our donors, right? In what we see time and again is when we have a transactional level relationship with our supporters, the biggest the biggest challenge is we can't weather economic storms. We can't weather challenges to mission or PR scandals, things of that nature, because we just don't have depth in those relationships. Whereas if you look at the organizations particularly education and medicine, where they understand that relationship is essential and they invest deeply in that before you even get to a solicitation, those organizations are able to maintain not just the relationships, but also the revenue, even through challenging times, because they focus first on that relationship.
Yeah, well said. And again, if we're not doing it for the philosophically right reasons, which we should, there is in fact a bottom line reason for what you're suggesting. And again, that can be lost in some of the flurry of some of these, frankly, companies who are indeed incented by volume. But you mentioned your company now believes in these kind of philosophies of relationship building. In fact, you have changed your career path slightly since the last time you and I talked. So talk about your new job, your new role, and what you're doing.
I have, and just to be really clear, because I don't want it to come off this way, I'm not trying to suggest that my previous employer does not understand relationships, right? It's this different mix. I did make a move. I don't know. Gosh, it feels like it's about 90 days ago. It's probably a little bit longer than that.
Right.
To a firm called Dickerson Baker, and I know you've had I think Derek on your show before talking about maybe one of the donor insights studies that we've done in the past. But
exactly.
Yeah, this firm is about 40 years old, and it was built on the idea of valuing relationship, right? Everything that we do is about, high level donor relationship engagement, relationships inside organizations. So principally over the last 40 years, we've done capital campaign consulting, major gift consulting, executive search, and helping organizations secure grant funding. So those things, again, if you think about them, they are very, very much relational focused versus transactionally focused. And so for me, joining this organization just made a lot of sense. I've known Derek and worked alongside him where we've had shared clients for over a decade. And we always talked about the idea that organizations don't necessarily get it right when they try to blend direct response fundraising and major gifts, capital campaigns, things of that nature. And it's really hard to get those companies to kind of play well in the sandbox because they have different incentives and they have different different perspectives on what it means to engage donors and to build relationship. So we just decided that, if we could envision a better way to do this, that it would probably be incumbent upon us to build it. And so that's what I came over here to do, is really just to build a fundraising platform that helps nonprofits raise revenue and build relationships in a better way.
Yeah, well put. And again, I'm excited for you. And as you said, listening to Derek certainly gave me more insight as to what your firm is all about. But I guess on a personal career planning journey, I'm sure, Andrew, there are a lot of people listening, maybe pondering, is it time for me to make my next move? And my sense is you weren't running away from something. You've been successful at every stop, but you were running towards something, I guess. But were there any characteristics of your decision? In other words, why make the move now?
Yeah, why make the move now? So ironically, Derek and I have had this conversation several times over the last 5 years, and each time we would surface the conversation, it didn't feel right. This last time when we, sat down and enjoyed a meal together in Asheville and just brainstormed what could be, it just felt like everything was falling into place from a timing perspective, and what he had been learning and developing in the firm, what I had been learning and developing skill set wise and experience wise, and also what's going on in the market, right? I mean, we can't look at what's gone on over the last 3 or 4 years and not think that when every other industry has been upended, that the fundraising and philanthropic services industry can be immune from that, right? So I think, between our personal journeys and just the world in general, it made a lot of sense to make this change now.
Well, and it strikes me too, Andrew, what you're very good at is what I guess I'd call strategic networking. And it seems to me that that's a skill or an experience everybody listening should think about, because you never know, right? You've had this relationship for a while and you just don't know when something clicks and an opportunity presents itself. And so again, you and Derek represent strategic networking, relationship building that in fact has led you to kind of yet another pinnacle maybe on your career journey. So excited for you.
Thank you. I mean, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but it goes back to what we said earlier, right? Relationships change everything, and this is all built on relationship.
Yeah, indeed. Well, let's jump back into what is not only great content you're talking about. It's almost a checklist inherent, I think, in what you have analyzed around direct response fundraising tactics. And as I looked at these things that we'll talk about, Andrew, these are principles that might apply to any of the tactics someone listening right now could apply to their fundraising. So, for example, you talk about a lot of our listeners are using an agency of some sort or using contract help around their direct response activities. But among the cautions you have, or I guess the things you would suggest, is you need to know exactly who you're working for, because maybe some of these companies are using relatively junior staff.
Yeah, well, so 2 things on this. I think organizations that can afford to outsource direct response fundraising should. And really it's because the market moves so fast on things that change in donor behavior and in the way that you need to learn and develop these skills, and you can't it's really hard for an organization to in-house the talent and keep them developed at the level where they can be kind of cutting edge successful. And so it's a lot easier for an external agency to do that or a consultant to do that, because there's a different financial incentive to keep those people sharp. And so I'm a big believer in outsourcing those kind of things. On the opposite side of that, I think it's smart to make sure that you have deep in-house talent when it comes to relationship fundraising, because it's really hard to authentically go out and sit with a donor and ask them for a significant investment in your organization if you're not deeply embedded in the mission of the organization itself. So that just as an aside. But yes, when I think about what it means to really have a partner alongside you in direct response in particular, I often think about two things. Are they aligned missionally with who we are as an organization? And do they have the expertise necessary to help us be successful, right? And so the point you keyed in on about the junior staff, right? It's a sad but somewhat funny commentary that one of the ways that agencies maximize profit in their organization is by minimizing the hourly cost of labor, right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
that often leads to at least to two things. It leads to limiting the scope of a project and just reducing the number of hours you're going to spend doing a thing, whatever that thing is. But it also leads to this idea of like, well, how can we hire junior talent and deploy them to do the day-to-day work so that we can still charge, whatever the amount is we're charging, but we just get more profit out of that because we have more junior people.
Yep.
And if the goal is to maximize agency profit, that model works very well. It works great in for-profit advertising. When I cut my teeth in this industry working at Russ Reed, we actually had a weekly hours meeting where we would go over these things and make sure, do you have the right amount of labor? Do you have the right blend of low versus high level labor so that we're maximizing profit? The conversation that was missing from that is the talent maximizing net revenue for our clients.
Yes.
And this is unfortunately, part of the equation that a savvy buyer of direct response fundraising services ought to be asking the agencies that they talk to, right? So, in my shop, we don't really hire junior level people. It's not because we have something against young people or early career people, but it's because the commitment that we make to our clients is that we're not going to use their fundraising capacity and their mission as a training ground for the next generation of direct marketers.
Yeah.
So our approach is different in that, everybody that sits in the seat on my team is a decade plus experience actually doing fundraising, many of them both at an agency, but also inside a nonprofit. And so it's just a different, perspective. And one of the things I remember, I had a client a long time ago when I was one of those junior people who said to me, like, why do I have to talk to 5 people before someone can solve my problem? And that's kind of stuck in the back of my head. And it's the exact challenge that organizations have in a model like the one I described, is that you have a lot of layers that have to level up to, say, a vice president or a director, someone who's actually got enough experience and enough authority in an agency to say, okay, here's how we're going to fix this, right? Or here's how we're going to make good on this challenge or this problem. Whereas in an environment where you just have more senior level people and more leaders, you can democratize that decision making and fix problems and address issues and capitalize on opportunities a lot faster than when you're using a pool of junior level talent.
Yeah, well put. And again, wonderful checklist item number 1 is know exactly who you're working with, right? When you're outsourcing any of these contract services, whether it be direct response or, frankly, a lot of nonprofits are using contract support in a lot of areas. And
for sure,
you're right.
Yeah.
The person who sold you the business may, in fact, not be the person who's going to actually be doing the critical work that your organization needs. And so that's a good reminder.
Patton, that's another one, right? I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've been in a presentation. In fact, it just happened to me last week, where someone says, I get that you're here and the president of the company's here and the senior this and that are here in the room for the sales meeting. Who's actually going to do the work, right? And that's just a really uncomfortable conversation to have, and the question behind that question comes from a place of someone who's actually had to have the conversation before and said, wait a minute, the value that we pay for, that we bought initially, is not the value that's being delivered today. And why do I have this disconnect? So it's a lot better to be able to say, the people sitting around this table today mapping out this solution with you that you're excited about are the same people who are going to execute it and take it to fruition for you.
Absolutely fair. And I'm holding up a mirror as a consultant myself. That's a fair question.
Yeah, we all have to.
Right. And these nonprofits, they have limited resources often. So they understandably have to steward their budgets and assure they're getting out of these investments what they deserve.
Well, and one thing about that is the buying process. If I had to give one critique on the nonprofit side of this is, I look at requests for proposal for direct response fundraising services all the time, and I can't tell you how disappointing most of those RFPs are, because they never ask questions that actually highlight what differentiators there are between service providers, and I feel like organizations don't understand business models enough to be able to spot things like this, and even ask the right questions to
right.
Oh, I should ask a question about not just how many people will work on my account, but what experience do they have, and how does that align with what I'm trying to achieve, and all those kind of things. It comes down most typically to who's got the lowest cost and who's got the shiniest new toy, and neither of those things are really going to serve organizations well for the long term.
Yeah, that sounds like a whole other episode, Andrew. I
Yeah,
might
sure.
want to explore that, because you're right. And again, we no criticism of nonprofit folks who may not know, they don't know what they don't know. So
Yeah.
their RFPs may be at a surface level, but not getting at the questions that you, in fact, know they need to be asking. Well, in another question, maybe that's a good segue to something you've pointed out in this kind of line of discussion. There's an efficiency in limiting variation to direct response activity, right? It's just same message, send it to everybody. But you, in fact, would argue that there needs to be variation. But maybe is that something you see nonprofits are wrestling with maybe the vendors that are serving them, and what is the need for segmentation need to be?
Yeah. No, again, it's a good question. And there are certain places where you need proven, consistent, communications, right? So, for example, in new donor acquisition, when you find let's use direct mail for now, just because it's easy. When you find a direct mail package that works really well with the audience that you're targeting in new donor acquisition, I would say do everything you can not to change that package. But the difference is you're sending it to new people every time you mail it.
Right.
So
right.
So it's new to them by the very nature of the fact that they're not an existing supporter. Where it becomes a struggle and where you have challenges is with existing supporters. And so I've run really small volume direct mail programs, a couple hundred donors in a file, and I've run programs for organizations that have 1 million plus names in their database, right? And it's really easy to say, oh, well, we have this lineup of 15, 20 different mailings, and we might change a reply envelope color here, we might test a new teaser statement on the outside of the envelope, maybe we'll test who's signing the letter, but largely it's the same creative, same message each time we mail it. We mail the June appeal every June, and we've been mailing it for 5 years, and it performs well, blah, 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 blah. And all of that can be true. And in fact, there are programs that are actually really, they raise a good amount of money, and they're highly efficient that way. One of the pieces of sort of, that's rolling around in my mind, though, and we see this with response rate, and I think it's part of what contributes to our retention challenges as well in the industry, is when a donor sees the same thing over and over again, it becomes really easy to say, oh, they just want my money again. I've heard this story 5 times.
Yeah.
I don't need to read this, right? Whereas if we can be creating a valuable insight and transferring information, storytelling, more deeply engaging, doesn't mean that every different mailing has to be, one has to have, gold glitter on it, and the other one has to have, a pop out organ grinder monkey. I mean, I'm not saying go crazy and spend like, a bunch of money to have really, really expensive stuff. In fact, oftentimes the cheapest looking stuff is what works the best. But what I am saying is you need to think about the fact that, in a long-term relationship, if you want to maintain the freshness in that relationship, you actually have to do things that look and feel different on an ongoing basis. so that the donor doesn't just get lulled into saying, I'm not going to respond.
I've already seen it. Right.
Now, the counter argument to that is you will have some donors who say, if I don't get the matching gift appeal in March, I'm not giving, right? Because that's what I give to. And so you also need a system and a platform that's flexible enough to say, maybe I do have this audience of donors that they're only ever going to respond to this one thing. And so I send them that in this time period, right? But I have all these other donors who want and need something different in order to stay engaged. So I need to have a different version of my stewardship or solicitation engagement, whether it's an email or a direct mail or whatever in that time period. So the organizations that are doing this well have baked in that cost and need for flexibility into their program.
And it speaks to maintaining good database management and understanding that when donors, if you have donors that give every year in March or December or whenever, you want to be responsive to that, right? Instead of not paying attention to any individual donors and again sending the same thing to everybody at the same time.
Yeah,
encourages that.
The data piece is so important, and it's really easy particularly in direct response fundraising for people to get enamored with the creative, right? It's what you can see, it's what you can feel, you can form an opinion on it. You get a gut reaction to it. But what's fascinating is that the return on investment for investing in creative is really low. And in fact, in some studies I've seen, it's about a 1-to-1 return.
Wow.
Whereas when you invest in audience and you find new audiences, you have deeper engagement and segmentation with existing audiences. You're able to tie an audience to a different kind of ask or offer. You can get upwards of a 20-to-1 return by focusing on the audience. So we often tell our clients, like, you're not going to see a big creative testing plan if you work with us, because creative's expensive and it doesn't move the needle. But you're going to see a ton of testing recommended that you can't actually see in a mail piece, because it's about who did we include or exclude, what story did we tell them, what program did we highlight based on what we know about them, what offer did we use, how much did we ask them for, and in what way. All of those things are data and programming, so they're behind the scenes, but they drive so much more of the value. And both nonprofit organizations and agencies, a lot of them anyway, tend to focus on the shiny objects and the creative, because again, it's easy to form opinions about. It's from an agency standpoint, it's a lot more profitable because you can charge a lot more for 6 or 7 creative tests than you can for a segmentation test. But what moves the needle on net revenue is the audience and the offer.
Yeah, well put. And it's the quality of your strategy, right? And certainly more argument for the segmentation and the intentional thought as to who gets what, and measuring that versus the volume and the quantity metrics that I'm afraid many of our colleagues maybe kind of get too focused on, and they lose sight of what you just said.
Absolutely. And the other thing is, this is a big argument for why organizations need to be investing and leaning heavily into more complex and sophisticated data. So organizations that are relying solely on their own transaction data in their database are going to get left behind very quickly, because the amount of data that's available externally and the relative cost effectiveness of that data today makes it actually really easy to add in other elements and to build models that are a lot more sophisticated than what most CRMs can do for segmentation, or what most individuals can program. And what we're finding is the biggest improvements that organizations are getting is when they're building those more sophisticated models and using a lot of different external data to enrich what they already know about their supporters, or even to help them find things that they had no clue about, and they couldn't tell from their CRM record data. And so what I often recommend is, if organizations aren't investing in that kind of external modeling, it's a game changer once they start it.
I love that. And again, you and I are not certainly against good graphic design, but as I listen to you, I'm thinking, yeah, you're so right. That I think a lot of folks out there are spending a ton in investing in a fancy new brochure or new collateral material or new web stuff. And you're saying, no, you'd be better off investing in that kind of research and analysis, right? To be more effective.
I mean, it depends on the goal, right? So if we're talking about a capital campaign, then absolutely I want to have some high level creative materials,
Right.
right? And I want to be able to go sit down with a donor, whether it's in a feasibility conversation or in a presentation, and have, a more sophisticated looking, piece of content to walk them through the vision for this, big new initiative, right? But when it comes to direct marketing, time and again we find that the direct marketing creative doesn't do anywhere near as much from a positive impact perspective as do data and analytics.
Yep. Great takeaway. And I'm underlining that in my notes. And I hope our listeners will pay close attention to that. Because again, I do not think that's always the case when there are discussions around budget time as to where we should invest. And that's giving them something to think about. And of course, Andrew, our show notes are going to link to multiple pieces of content you've done on this in terms of, because you've done deeper dives on the checklist, if you will, and some of these dirty secrets that perhaps we need to consider. But I want to move to the question our listeners, guys. All right, Andrew, what do I do? Where should I focus? And you had 3 really good, I thought, recommendations in some of the stuff you and I have talked about before. But number one, you're saying just invest in stewardship. So what do you mean, or what examples might you give in terms of where you want to see nonprofit leaders spend their time and energy?
Yeah, when I talk about stewardship, I go back to sort of the kind of original definition of that, right? So someone who's stewarding something, essentially what that means is you are taking care of something that was entrusted to you by another, right? And I think it's really ironic that we oftentimes in this sector have conversations about, these are my donors. This is our money, to invest in this program or that program. And in reality, it's not, right? It is hard-earned money from individual donors or from corporate partners, whoever they may be. And they have said, we align with what you're doing. We want to accomplish this thing in the world. And therefore, we are giving you this money for this purpose. And, if we are good stewards of that, it doesn't just mean that we don't spend money, right? It means that we are wisely investing that capital to achieve a mission impact. And so when I think about stewardship, for us, it's that piece. So doing what we said we would do and what the donor asked us to do with those funds, and doing it effectively, right? Not just kicking the can, not just putting a Band-Aid on a problem, but really deploying those resources in a way that solves problems. And then beyond that, actually reporting back and showing the donor that, you can trust us, not just with this investment that you made, but with future investments, because we honored your expectation and we delivered on mission in the way that we said we would, right?
Yeah. Love how intentional you are with your language. I think that's something, again, I would underscore that you describe. Your pronoun usage even was very intentional there. And I think that's a great takeaway for nonprofit leaders to think about. How does your message get conveyed in that terminology? And of course, and you said you want to see more impact reporting. Tell the story, but maybe you could expand on that. What do you mean? And is that a good kind of year-end report, or how can I do that better?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a couple of different things, right? So the first and easiest place for a lot of organizations still send out newsletters, right? So whether it's a quarterly newsletter, whether it's twice a year, whether it's email or print, I don't really care. But using those newsletters, not to tell donors how amazing you are, but to tell them how amazing they are, right? And this goes counter to some of the emerging narratives about, donors not being saviors and all this kind of stuff. Like, I get where that comes from, but I got to tell you, if you want to raise revenue to actually accomplish mission, and if your mission is more important than your personal comfort, then you've got to do it this way.
Yeah.
And so what I mean by that is the stories in a newsletter need to say to the donor, because of you, we were able to accomplish this. Because of all of our supporters, you included, this person's life has been meaningfully and positively impacted. We've solved this problem. We've overcome this challenge. and being able to not necessarily share a lot of facts and figures. It's really easy to pull together, P&L data and throw it in on a screen or on a chart.
Right,
But
right.
what motivates people and what gets people to act is a story. So the more that we can tell firsthand stories of lives changed and of things made better because of the strategic investment of donors, the better off we're going to do. So that's one. But then I think in a very personal way, particularly with monthly givers, with mid-level donors, with major donors, of course, capital campaign investors, and even those who've left our organization in their legacy plan. That's where like a personal impact report becomes very important, and that literally often is a letter. It might be accompanied with some charts and graphs, but really it's a letter that warmly and authentically thanks them for their investment, articulates what you did with every gift they gave. So if they gave one gift and you asked for it for a specific purpose, you're reporting back on that purpose, right? If they gave 10 gifts and you asked for them for various purposes, my expectation is that impact report's going to highlight all those things, right? And
Nice. Yep.
and again, celebrating what they've helped accomplish, talking about the partnership and the fact that you all are side by side with them in this fight, in this initiative to do whatever good it is you're trying to do in the world, and reminding the donor that it's not finished yet, right? And that's a key point, because if you celebrate so much that it feels like everything's done, then the donor can say, well, great, they're in a great place. I can turn around and deploy my resources somewhere else now. And if that's true, great. Be honest about it.
Right.
Most organizations aren't in that space, and so what you have to do is you have to say, this is all amazing. You've helped us get so far, and we have a vision to do even more next year. We hope you'll come alongside us again, right? Yeah. So it's not an ask, but it's a nod to the fact that we're not finished together yet.
I love that. Obviously, if I'm thinking of a small shop nonprofit leader, perhaps there is just the capacity to how far can I go down my list? And I'm guessing you would agree that, is this a prioritization exercise? Frankly, I need to think about if I can get to my top 50 donors or whatever the number is. I guess you want to do it for every donor if possible, but I guess I'm weighing the reality of capacity.
So if you're a small shop and you're doing this in-house, then absolutely, right? Derek Baker he's really fond of this saying, and I think it is absolutely on point. And it is simply that big gifts add up faster, right? So, if you have limited resources and limited capacity and you're doing this on your own, I would absolutely say, let's take our top 25 to 50 donors, whatever capacity you have, right? And focus on those first. And then as capacity becomes available over time, then go further and further down the list. If you're working with an agency partner, this is something that an agency should be able to do. Now, the rub is these are going to be low volume just because of the nature of what they are. And a lot of agencies aren't set up for that because it's more cost prohibitive to them to do small volume work than the big thousands of pieces of mail at a time kind of thing. But you could work with an agency partner. We do this all the time for our clients, where we're producing impact reports like this and customizing it to every donor based on their giving, based on what about them and what insights you have, and then either sending them out on behalf of the organization or sending them back to the organization. This is another one for customization for a development officer or a CEO to actually put a handwritten thank you note on, to drop in a special note of encouragement, whatever it might be, and make these feel like you actually know who the donor is.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And in fact, is a good segue. I guess we will finish where we started today in this discussion. Your third kind of key piece of advice is focusing on relationships, right? And the personal relationship. I guess the handwritten note is one of many examples I know you could give. Is there anything else you would advise in terms of that kind of personal relationship part of this equation?
Yeah, it's funny. I think I tick off a lot of nonprofit CEOs when, one of the questions I get very frequently is, hey, what's new that we should be thinking about? And my first response is always, Well, you should be thinking about picking up the phone and calling your donors. And when was the last time you did that? And then I get this like grumpy, grimacing face because they know that they don't spend enough time calling donors, but it doesn't feel good because it's not the same thing as being like, oh yeah, we got this great new social media tool. It's going to allow us to do this, this, and this. And, we can push out thousands of messages, nuts to all of that.
Yeah,
if
right.
you really want to make a meaningful impact in this world for your cause, the best way to do that is to get face-to-face with donors who can give you transformational gifts. And that starts with a phone call, right? So
couldn't agree more. And yes,
phone calls, highly personalized letters, and not for all donors. Some donors don't want it. Roy Jones, really good friend of mine, co-hosts a podcast, written some books with me, exceptional fundraiser. He has raised 7-figure gifts through text messaging.
Wow.
Not spamming people asking for money, but donors who say to him, I'm really busy, I travel internationally, I do this and this. The best way to get me is to text me. And so he knows, hey, I'm going to build a relationship with that donor one text message at a time, right? But that's what's meaningful with that donor. And so this all is predicated on actually knowing your donor.
Yes.
And if you don't get proximate with your supporters, there's no way you can do this.
Fantastic. Just like everything else you've shared. Once again, Andrew, I'm grateful for this and many items that our listeners can ponder, I think, both in their personal kind of leadership journey as well as their organization. So for all of that, I'm grateful. Lots of reasons to check out the show notes for this episode, and we'll link everything up. In fact, one more thing I'd like to put in the show notes, Andrew, as you know, is a book recommendation. So if you got something else that has come across your bookshelf that you might share with our listeners?
Yeah. So right now I am reading a book called The Inbound Organization, and it's written really for business to business readers, people who are in kind of sales environment. But what I love about it and why I think that nonprofits should consider it is that it talks a lot about moving from an environment where you are just blasting out a marketing message and trying to attract attention that way to creating content and engagement that actually draws people to you, right? And I think one of the biggest long-term opportunities for value creation in the nonprofit sector is creating content that people want to engage with, so that you don't start the relationship off transactionally and set a tone for, okay, I would be happy with you always giving $15. You start off with a meaningful engagement that helps to, enlighten someone, that shares an insight with them, that builds credibility. And down the road, it doesn't have to be years down the road, it could be weeks down the road, you might ask for a gift, but that inbound content engagement brings people closer to you and makes them feel like they know you and you know them in a way that transactional fundraising can't. So check it out. It's a good book.
Excellent. And certainly consistent with the theme of our conversation, and getting behind the dirty little secrets that sometimes do invade our sector and our industry. But I'm delighted to lift up that and all of the relationship management tools that you have offered. So Andrew, once again, thanks for joining me, and thanks for joining our listeners through this podcast. Where can people go now to find out more about you and the great work you're doing?
Yeah, a couple different places. So I will actually give you a link to put in the show notes where people can download the Dirty Little Secrets document that we've been talking through. Your listeners can always find me on LinkedIn. I am there regularly. And if not there, check us out at dickersonbaker.com or email me at andrew.olsen@dickersonbaker.com.
Wonderful. Thanks, Andrew, once again for joining me on the path.
Thanks, Pat, and I appreciate it.
Well, I know you enjoyed this conversation with Andrew as much as I did, and I hope you came away with some practical ideas that can allow you to better assess whatever you're doing in terms of direct response fundraising right now, and maybe more importantly, give you ideas to become a better relationship builder, which is, of course, critical to all fundraising efforts. Don't forget about the show notes. They are available for this episode. It's number 198. Just go to the podcast page at patmcdowell.com where you can find out more about Andrew, his great books and content, his fantastic Rainmaker fundraising podcast, and of course more information on the work he's doing through Dickerson Baker. As always, I hope you will share this episode with just one other person on the path. And if you haven't already, you can subscribe. Just go to the podcast page at patmcdowell.com and you will see the follow button, which will assure you don't miss out on any of these weekly episodes. They come out every Thursday. Of course, if you like this episode, make sure you click on the episodes button. You can find Andrew's previous appearance on the podcast. It was episode number 145, as well as scroll through thumbnails of some of our most popular episodes or search by topic or guest name. Thanks again for all you are doing in the nonprofit sector, especially right now, and keep up the good work for causes that are most meaningful to you. I'll keep bringing you content that can help you do it even better. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time on The Path.